for human trafficking each year. That's 300 of these slides with 1,000 figures, and it's enough to fill Citizen Bank Park almost 7 times over. $200,000 per year is what a pimp stands to make from just one victim. 15 years. That's the age by which most child victims are lured into sex trafficking, 15 years old. That's 9th grade. But I'd like to get away from the numbers, which are somewhat unreliable and likely the tip of the iceberg in many cases. See, when we try to count these traffickers, when we see them, they vanish, they scatter, they morph, they change into the nice lady down the street, or her uncle, his boss, her boyfriend. They live among us, and so do their victims. So I'm a physician. I knew about human trafficking. I read the news. I read about the sex trafficking ring in Bosnia, run by UN peacekeepers in the year 2000. I read about sex tourism in Thailand. I read Cheryl Woodan and Nicholas Kristof's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Half the Sky. Good read. I knew about human trafficking for organs, for labor, for sex. It happened in other countries until I saw it in our operating room. Now, my patients, they feel like my family. My patients' identities are obviously confidential, and their stories really aren't mine to tell. But my patients are memorable, and they're more compelling than any numbers. And they've really shaped the way that I think about others. So yes, while I was in medical school, I was in the operating room for what was actually quite a benign and mundane surgery, except for the fact that this woman had needed this surgery eons ago. So she came in, she was anesthetized, and then we undraped her to clean the areas for incision, and there it was. Dollar signs tattooed into her groin, expletives tattooed into her groin. Now, thankfully, none of us laughed, none of us traded lewd comments about the patient. Instead, we just looked at each other in surprise, and we just figured, well, to each her own. We missed it. I missed it. I didn't see it. I didn't see her. So lesson number 1, it is said that the eye doesn't see what the mind doesn't know. We didn't know what we were seeing because we didn't know what we were looking at. We didn't know the signs right in front of us, the tattoos, the late presentation to medical care. These are typical signs of sex trafficking right in front of us. And if we as healthcare professionals don't make it our business to learn about human trafficking, then we will miss it every time. So fast forward 1 year, and I'm now a pediatric intern on labor and delivery. So that means that I have my MD, but I'm now training to be a pediatrician. A young lady is brought in from the street, and she has delivered her baby on the street when the ambulance couldn't get there in time. By the time the baby made it to my care, it was cold, but otherwise remarkably healthy. The young woman sat in bed, quite composed, full makeup, beautiful hair, manicured nails, jeweled, and there was a man who stood in the corner. I figured he was the father, so I walked over to congratulate him, and he stared me down, crossed his hands in front of his chest, and said nothing. So I made my way back to the woman, and I asked her, so, did you get any prenatal care? She said no, she didn't need prenatal care. I said, okay, well, how long were you in labor? She said that she had been having contractions for 3 or 4 days, but she had to work, so she just took painkillers and kept working. So I asked her, what kind of work would prevent you from coming into the hospital to deliver your baby? And she paused, and then she said that she was a receptionist. She looked uneasy. I felt uneasy. I had 3 or 4 other deliveries to attend to, so I left. I didn't follow up. I didn't attempt to get her by herself away from her very intimidating male partner so that I could ask her more questions. I was frightened. So I said to a nurse, there is something really wrong in that room, and then I left. Lesson number 2, it is not enough to see. We have got to act, and it is hard to act. It takes courage, it takes training, it takes support, it takes a team of people to help us to help others. And we have got to stand up and step in, because if we don't, then it's possible that nobody else will. Now, there are some patients for whom I did step in. There's the 15-year-old white middle-class girl who came into our emergency department after running away from her parents. She had been on the street for about 4 days. And I asked her some of the screening questions that I had learned to ask after training with GEMS. GEMS is Girls Education Mentoring Services. It's a nonprofit organization in New York City that specializes in working with female victims of sex trafficking. So I walked up to this patient and I said, look, I'm a physician. I don't mean any offense, but I've seen a lot of different kids from a lot of different situations, and I just need to know, when you were on the streets, did you have to trade sex for anything, for food, for shelter, for money? She shrugged and she said, yeah, sure, I needed a place to stay, and I traded sex for a Happy Meal once. I took in this information without shock, without disgust. This was simply her reality. Thankfully, that particular patient was not being trafficked, but she was at risk. See, 1/3 of kids who run away from home are approached by a trafficker within 48 hours of running away. They're approached in a park, at the bus stop, at the mall, even in school. Some kids even keep going to school while they're being trafficked. They live at home and they go to school. So in my 3rd year of residency in pediatrics, I was in the emergency department and I overheard an emergency medicine doc discussing one of the patients who had just come into the ER. And as I listened, something sounded off. She gave some fuzzy answers to questions about sex and about risk for sexually transmitted infection. And so I said to this ER doc, hey, I don't mean to pry, but it seems like your patient might be in the life, which is slang for sex trafficking. He kind of laughed a little, and then he looked at me like I had 2 heads, and he said, oh, okay. So I said to him, look, would you mind if I asked your patient some questions? And he said, sure, go ahead. So I did, and it turned out this girl and her friends were being bussed into the city by their pimp every weekend to work the hotels, to work the conferences, and then they were being bussed back to school on Monday. They turn in their homework, they watch their little brothers and sisters after school until mom gets home, they come to see their doctors, and they're trafficked. This particular girl came into our emergency department with her pimp, who soon fled, and then this girl told the emergency medicine docs that she just wanted her mommy. Lesson number 3, be prepared to be derided. People still roll their eyes at me. I've been mocked. I consider it a small price to pay for doing what I know is right. And I am happy to report that many of my patients have been connected to resources, to housing, job training, and legal resources. Lastly, I spoke recently at a medical school, and the medical school student said to me, how is it that you see so many trafficked patients? I don't think I see any more trafficked patients than other physicians. It's just that I've developed eyes to see them. And I ask. And I just want to close with some of the resources, because people frequently ask me, what can I do? Some of the resources that I mentioned are GEMS. They are nonprofit. Donations go a long way with this organization. They house trafficked girls. PATH is one of the organizations that I helped found, the Physicians Against the Trafficking of Humans, and we do a lot of research and we spend our time educating medical professionals. And then there are a number of other places, Dawn's Place here in Philadelphia, Sanctuary for Families, Covenant House, that offer services to trafficked youth. HEAL is an academic source for people in law enforcement and medicine who work on the issue of human trafficking. And for your definitive resource, go to Polaris Project Online. They have all of the updated stats for the United States and globally. Thank you.
Victim testimony is about to begin. Inside a brightly lit Santa Barbara, California courtroom, seated at counsel table, is the prosecutor, the detective, the defense attorney, and the defendant. He's dressed in an orange jail suit, smugly waiting for the victim to be escorted into the courtroom. She was discovered some 10 days earlier in a local motel room on a Thursday morning in October of 2014. The police had found an advertisement of what appeared to be an underage girl advertised on the internet to anyone who was willing to purchase sex. So they went to this motel room on a main street in our city, situated between two upper middle class neighborhoods, and they contacted her. She was in the lobby. They showed her the picture and she said, "Yeah, that's me." And the pimp, he's up in room 208. And the police made chase, and they got him, and they arrested him, and here he was today in the court. Courtroom. As the victim advocate for the district attorney's office, I escort the victim into the courtroom. She climbs up onto the witness stand. She settles in, and she prepares to tell her story. Not just the story of how she had gotten here today, but she would tell her story about how she came into the life as a human trafficking victim. The prosecutor is trying to set this up for the court. It's a preliminary hearing, so the idea is to present enough evidence to believe that a felony was committed. And he knew this was not going to be a small thing to prove to the court that this was a felony. So he begins questioning her about the life. Miss Doe, can you explain to the court what it means to be in the life, in the game, like you explained to the police? Well, sure. Well, that's like when you're doing dates for money, and there's rules, and there's people in charge. And Miss Doe, when you say people in charge, who are you referring to? Well, like the bottom, like the bottom's in charge. The bottom, Miss Doe, can you explain to the court what the bottom is? Well, yeah, like the bottom bitch. She's the one that keeps the other girls in line in the stable. She sometimes posts the ads. She collects the money. I see. And is there more than one girl usually working? Well, sure, like there's usually more than one girl working for the pimp, like in the stable. Do you need me to break this down? I'm sorry, Miss Doe. The court needs to understand this. You all really should know this shit. And she was right. We should have known this shit, but we didn't. We didn't understand not only the terms and the words that describe human trafficking, but the faces of the people and the girls that were the victims of sex trafficking in our own community. And even working as a victim advocate in the district attorney's office for over 20 years and interacting with lots of different victims of crime, I didn't know that this was happening in our own backyard, on a main street between two upper middle class neighborhoods next to a coffee shop that I frequented. And in fact, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, some 300,000 kids in the United States are being sex trafficked on any given day. 300